Hi everybody, this is Mr. Gann, and this is my video lecture for Alex Richardson's STEM project. And today we're going to be talking about coral bleaching. I know you guys are probably expecting a traditional whiteboard lecture, however, um, couldn't really make it happen, so I'm doing it this way. We have a short presentation about coral bleaching. It's something that I'm quite passionate about. I went to school at the University of Hawaii, and I was surrounded by beautiful corals. And unfortunately, corals are becoming bleached, and they have quite the big impact on not only our environment, but our society. So let's talk about it. Alright, so our outline for today is what are coral reefs, and why, for outline is what are corals and coral reefs. We'll give you a little insight to what they actually are. There's common misconceptions about what corals are. We're going to talk about why coral reefs are important. Then we'll get into what is coral bleaching, what are the causes of it, and then lastly, why is it important, and what can we do to help. So what are corals and coral reefs? Coral reefs as a whole are actually one of the most diverse marine ecosystems. Excuse me. Yeah, so if you look at this picture down here, as you can see, they're quite abundant, right? It's quite diverse. There's different colors, different species of corals, and along that comes different species of fish, and things like that. And so it's quite amazing that coral reefs are the most diverse marine ecosystem. When you're thinking about it, you may think, but we don't really see coral reefs, that often, right? Because actually, coral reefs are actually only like 1% of the entire ocean, right? And that's actually really small. Coral reefs are only found in tropical or subtropical locations. That's kind of why we don't see it. But despite only being 1%, they're quite diverse. Um, so let's talk about corals. So corals are actually animals. There's a common misconception that corals are either a plant or, if you've ever felt coral, they're quite rigid. It feels like either a rock or some sort of innate ocean thing, right? But in reality, they're actually animals. They're inverts, so they're invertebrates, and they have a unique symbiotic relationship with an algae. This algae is called zooxanthellae. Z-O-X-A-N. And this is what is the main focus about our coral bleaching. It's this relationship with the symbiotic relationship that corals have with the zooxanthellae is essentially the main cause of coral bleaching, which we'll talk about next. But without this relationship, corals would not be as prominent as they are now. Um, Not only do the zooxanthellae, it's a type of algae, so they photosynthesize. They photosynthesize to receive nutrients, and then they share those resources with the corals, and actually it's what gives coral their color. And it's this sharing of resources that allows corals to thrive. All right, so why are coral reefs important? As I said, we know that coral reefs are the most diverse um, marine ecosystem, right? And when I say diverse, we could also look at the amount of species that rely on coral reefs. And it's actually quite a bit. It's a quarter. It's 25% of all ocean species rely on coral reefs. So obviously, if coral reefs were to start bleaching and start to die, it's going to affect the rest of the ocean, right? A quarter of the ocean. Um, Coral reefs are also important because they protect shorelines. If you think about where coral reefs are located, around islands and different parts of the ocean, they protect those shorelines, um, and protect those people, those shorelines, and the people living on those islands. It also supports the fishing industry because 25% of ocean species rely on coral reefs. That also means a source of food. If you think about those small islands in Polynesia or Micronesia, for example, most of their food comes from coral reefs and the oceans around their islands. So, as you can imagine, once if corals die, people are going to suffer, because they don't have their food supply. In other places like Hawaii and Australia, coral reefs are also, they provide tourist revenue, right? They provide that money, and they provide that tourist attraction because coral reefs are also seen as very vibrant, very pretty places to go visit, and that's going to attract people to come see them, which then of course brings in money. All right, so what is coral bleaching? As I said before, coral bleaching, um, if you're to leave anything from this, extracurricular idea, is that it's when the relationship between corals, the actual animal, that polyp or coral, and its zooxanthellae, it's when that becomes stressed, or it doesn't, that relationship is no longer beneficial and it's no longer there. Unfortunately, now 75% of worldwide corals are in some stage of bleaching. Um, so when I say a stage of bleaching, I mean a stage at which the zooxanthellae, right, that algae that corals have a symbiotic relationship, actually is leaving, and it's leaving the coral, like leaving its coral home. Um, it's generally due to environmental stressors, which I'll talk about in the next slide, but it's when corals become stressed and the zooxanthellae leave those hosts. Um, when it when those zooxanthellae do leave, corals become more susceptible to diseases and other things. Here we have a diagram. We have healthy coral, right? As you can see, um, the zooxanthellae is essentially covering, this entire area, right? Um, that's where it's housed. That's where they have their their symbiotic relationship. Excuse me. And then as we move towards bleach coral, as you can see, that zooxanthellae is being expelled, right? That zooxanthellae no longer, I guess, no longer can live in those conditions, right? It's stressed to the point where they have to leave. And once they leave, eventually corals can die. Corals, because they're not getting those nutrients from the zooxanthellae, they'll eventually die, become more susceptible to diseases, as I said, and other problems like turf algae coming in and taking the place, covering the algae and causing it to die. So, all right. So, what causes bleaching? As I said before, um, bleaching occurs because of environmental stressors, and it's environmental stressors like changes in temperature, runoff and pollution, sedimentation, and overexposure to sunlight. If you kind of think back to some of the other lectures that you may have learned in biology class, a lot of these kind of sound like climate change, right? Climate change. Unfortunately, that is one of the big problems with coral bleaching, is because it's due to climate change, right? Our human actions are causing our climate, our temperature to rise, which then is causing not only corals, but different species and organisms across our planet to become threatened, to become endangered, can be even become extinct. So when I'm talking about environmental stressors, the main cause of coral bleaching is the change in temperatures. Excuse me. Um, and changes in temperature, either an increase in temperature, right, increase, or a decrease. Either way, corals have a small range at which they can really live and thrive, and anything outside of that makes corals become very stressed, which then causes them to expel their zooxanthellae. Things like runoff and pollution, um, you know, when pollution and runoff and sedimentation, covers the coral, that the it blocks the zooxanthellae from photosynthesizing. And when zooxanthellae cannot photosynthesize, they're not sharing the resources with the coral host, causing them to become stressed and eventually to leave. A bleached coral can recover; it's not too severe. I threw a picture here of a white, very white color. That's why we call it bleaching. Um, you know, a bleached coral like this, some of it could survive because you could see it's not quite being covered by like a turf algae. Like some of the dark brown spots right here, that particular section of the coral may not survive because it's already been invaded by invasive algae. But some of the other ones that are still all white could could survive. All right, so why is this important? What can we do to help? As you may have realized earlier, coral reefs are very important to people. Not only do they um, not only do they supply food for a lot of people, but it's a big source of money, right? Coral reefs are estimated to have a value of about $30 billion, which is a lot of money, right? $30 billion is the value of coral reefs. Value of coral reefs, which is quite a lot, right? And if you could imagine what would happen, I kind of alluded earlier, what would happen if coral reefs became extinct and all of the corals became bleached, right? Tourist revenue would go down in certain places. You know, different groups of people will run out of food and eventually have to go elsewhere, right? So if you think about it, there's a large value in coral reefs. So, things that we do to help. The first one is to limit your impact on global climate change. We talked about this in previous lectures in your biology class, I'm sure, that what can you do to help climate change, right? Avoid driving, right? Taking public transportation, carpooling, riding your bike, skateboarding, things like that. Um, avoid the burning of our natural resources. That's the main step, is to reduce our emissions into the environment. Is one of our big one of our one of our biggest things we can do to limit our impact on global warming. Other things you can do is contact your local legislators to support comprehensive climate change legislation. You know, while doing your part, eventually could help, with that fight with climate change. It really needs to be a large group effort in order for climate change um, for anything to really make a change about to make a difference with climate change. Um, Also, contact your legislators to help establish marine protected areas, we're called MPAs. These are um, either state or government run, um, like wildlife sanctuaries or marine sanctuaries that protect and work towards the restoration of marine resources. And there's good number of established marine protected areas that um, its main focus is the restoration of coral reefs. The most notable one is the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. Um, that is an entire protected sanctuary thanks to former President Obama, that established, fishing regulations in that area and really put big strides into protecting our coral reefs in this planet. So, just some food for thought to think about it. Um, yeah, so that's really it for my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys learned some new stuff. Thanks for helping Alex out, and hope you enjoyed my lecture.